In this lab review, we're going to take a look at this heart model. Now, the heart has 4 chambers. We have 2 atria at the top, so the right atrium, left atrium, and 2 ventricles, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And what divides them is going to be AV valves, or atrial ventricular valves. Okay? And we have one on each side. Now, the AV valves have a specific name. On the right side of the heart, we have this one called the tricuspid valve. Let me get that in the camera. There we go. The tricuspid valve. And it's called tricuspid because a cusp is a flap, and this has 3 flaps. On the other side, this AV valve only has 2 flaps, so it's called the bicuspid valve or mitral valve. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in a little bit here. So blood is going to come from the body through these vessels from the upper part of the body. It's going to eventually drain into the superior vena cava. From the lower portion of the body, it's going to come into from the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Most of the blood is going to flow in passively from the right atrium into the right ventricle when the heart is relaxed, or in what we call diastole. Now, during systole, atrial systole specifically, the atria are going to contract, and that's just going to force a little extra blood that's in the atria through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Now, both ventricles are contracting at the same time. So again, on the left atria, that blood is going to also be forced into the left ventricle. But we're going to talk about it as if it contracts separately. So again, right atria contracts at the start of atrial systole, forces the blood into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. Then during ventricular systole, the ventricles contract, and if we're looking at the right side of the heart, again, these are going to contract simultaneously, but we'll take each side of the heart separately. Then the tricuspid valve will slam shut, keeping the blood from going back into the right atrium. But when pressure reaches a certain point, then the pulmonary valve or pulmonic valve will open. Now, these are called semilunar valves. And we have one other semilunar valve I'll mention in a second. So this pulmonary valve will open up. Blood will then go into what's called the pulmonary trunk. And this is what messes people up, because we look at these blood vessels here and they're blue, so we want to think that they're veins, right? Because we have a vena cava right here. These are the brachiocephalic veins going into the superior vena cava. But we look at this and we say, oh, it's blue, it must be a vein. No, here's what you want to remember. Veins go toward the heart, like this, like these vessels here. They go toward the heart. Arteries go away from the heart. So the pulmonary trunk is actually an artery because it's going away. The blood's going away from the heart. Then it's going to branch into a right, and you can't really see it under there, and a left pulmonary artery. Don't get that confused. Forget about the color of the vessel. Even though it's blue, the blood is going away from the heart, making this an artery. Okay? So the blood is then going to go to the lungs, where it's going to give up its carbon dioxide, it's going to pick up oxygen, and it's going to come back to the left atrium through, and let me just turn this around, we can see it just a little bit better. These vessels here, this is the right and left. Okay, the red, but don't let it confuse you. It's going toward the heart. So these are the pulmonary veins. Even though they're carrying oxygenated blood and they're painted red, these are still the right and left pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary veins are going to then empty into the right atrium. The right atrium contracts, pushing blood through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, we go through another semilunar valve right there, and that's the aortic valve. So when blood gets pushed into the aortic valve, it's then going to go up into the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and then the descending or thoracic aorta, and then out to the rest of the body. Okay. Now the first branches off of the aorta, well, think about this. Who's doing all the work? Who wants first dibs on that fresh oxygenated blood? Well, the heart. So we have blood vessels that actually feed the heart or give oxygen to the heart. And that's going to be the right and left. And you'll have to imagine that this vessel goes up under the pulmonary trunk and then it also attaches to the ascending aorta. But this is your right and left coronary arteries. If we look at the right side, we have the right coronary artery. It comes down. There's going to be branches coming off along the margin of the heart here. We're going to call this the marginal artery. In the front, we have the anterior interventricular artery. Think about an interstate. What does an interstate do? It's a road in between two states. This is a vessel in between two ventricles. So that's why we call it the anterior interventricular artery. Now there's an old term for it as well. And if you're working in a hospital, then you might hear this term as the LAD, or left anterior descending artery. So it has a couple of names that you're going to want to know. Okay. So again, clinically you might hear it as an LAD because this is one that's very common that they'll do coronary artery bypass graft on. So in other words, a heart bypass. And oftentimes they will just refer to it as the LAD, left anterior descending artery. Okay. But again, as far as an anatomical nomenclature goes, know it as the anterior interventricular artery. Okay. Then we have a branch coming off that's called the circumflex branch. That circumflex branch goes all the way around to the back, and it's going to then supply blood to the posterior interventricular artery. Okay, so again, the posterior interventricular artery. We can see that. Now, every heart model is going to look a little bit different, and that's because every heart's going to look a little slightly different. This one shows the right and left branches here coming together. Other heart models, and again, other real hearts, they may not totally connect like this. Okay? And in some individuals, and these are normal variants, the anterior interventricular artery can actually come down and hook up with the posterior interventricular artery. And then we've got some veins. This is the great cardiac vein. Let's see. This is the anterior cardiac vein. Coming around, the veins are going to empty into this, and this is the coronary sinus. Okay, so coronary sinus. And I mentioned that there was another vessel that emptied into the right atrium. Well, that other vessel is the coronary sinus, and here is the opening to that right there. Let's see, bring it up close. There we go. So that's the opening to the coronary sinus. And so one more quick review on blood flowing through the heart. We would have blood coming from the upper part of the body, going into the superior vena cava, lower part of the body, emptying into the inferior vena cava, into the right atrium. From the right atrium, it's going to go through the tricuspid valve. From the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Right ventricle contracts. It goes into the pulmonary valve or pulmonic valve, and then up into the pulmonary trunk, and then through the right and left pulmonary arteries. Don't let the color fool you. Okay? It's going away from the heart. So pulmonary arteries. Goes to the lungs. It gets rid of carbon dioxide, picks up oxygen, comes back through the pulmonary. Okay, forget about that they're red. They're going back toward the heart, so that makes them veins. So these are the pulmonary veins. And again, on the back of the heart, we can also see pulmonary veins. Into the right atrium. From the right atrium through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, it then sends blood through the aortic valve into the aorta, the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, the descending aorta. First branches off are going to be the right and left coronary arteries. In another video, we'll talk about the different vessels coming off the heart up at the top. One other thing is this. This is called the Ligamentum Arteriosum. And in a fetus, this is actually a tube connecting the pulmonary arteries to the aorta, because the fetus does not use its lungs, so a lot of the blood is going to bypass going to the lungs, and this is one of the ways it'll do it, is through this. And then also I mentioned the fossa ovalis. That is an opening from the right atrium to the left atrium, and once the baby is born, there's pressure changes, that valve closes up and then seals up. Sometimes it doesn't, and it might need to be surgically closed, and that can cause what we call a blue baby. And why we call the baby a blue baby is because the baby is cyanotic, because it's going to receive a mixture of oxygenated and unoxygenated blood. Because of that hole, we get what's called a right to left shunt, and that's where the blood shunts from the right heart to the left heart without going to the lungs. And so again, the baby is not going to be well oxygenated. And that concludes our review. I hope this helped.